One waitress, one elderly black woman, one terrible mistake. When Lisa threw coffee on her in disgust, she thought she had the upper hand. But just minutes later, she realized she had insulted the most powerful woman in the room. The morning rush had just begun at Westwood Café, a small but bustling coffee shop in the heart of the city. The scent of fresh espresso filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of conversations and the occasional clatter of ceramic cups. It was a chilly winter morning, and customers filtered in, shaking off the cold as they settled into their usual routines. Behind the counter, Lisa, a young waitress in her mid-20s, moved with practiced efficiency. With a bright smile and warm greetings, she served steaming cups of coffee to well-dressed businessmen and affluent patrons who frequented the cafe. To them, she was charming, polite, and quick with service. But to those who didn't fit her idea of deserving customers, she could be dismissive, sometimes even outright rude. Lisa had always believed she could tell what kind of person someone was just by looking at them. The rich, the important, the powerful. They deserved her attention. The ones who looked poor? A waste of her time. That was exactly what went through her mind when an elderly black woman walked into the cafe that morning. The woman was wrapped in a worn-out coat, her shoes scuffed from years of use. Her silver-streaked hair peeked out from under an old woolen hat, and her hands, slightly rough from age, clutched a small handbag. She moved carefully, as if she was used to being ignored, or worse, unwelcome. Lisa's smile faded the moment she saw her. "Great, another one," she muttered under her breath. The elderly woman approached the counter, her voice soft but steady. "A small black coffee, please." Lisa barely acknowledged her, giving a quick nod before turning to serve a man in a designer suit who had just stepped up beside her. The man ordered a large caramel macchiato, and without hesitation, Lisa prioritized his drink first. The elderly woman stood there, patient, as she watched Lisa work. Her expression didn't change. There was no frustration, no anger, just quiet observation. When Lisa finally placed a small coffee cup in front of her, she did it without a word, without a smile, and without the respect she had shown every other customer that morning. The elderly woman reached for the cup, but before she could take it, Lisa rolled her eyes and sighed dramatically. "Are you planning to pay for that, or are you expecting it for free?" A few nearby customers turned to look, sensing the tension. The elderly woman simply blinked, then reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp bill, setting it gently on the counter. Lisa scoffed, grabbing the money and shoving it into the register. "Didn't think so." As the elderly woman walked to an empty table in the corner, Lisa smirked to herself. Just another nobody. But in just a few minutes, Lisa would realize that she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Lisa continued working, moving from table to table, greeting customers she deemed important, while completely ignoring the elderly woman in the corner. The cafe buzzed with conversations, the clinking of spoons against porcelain, and the occasional ring of the register. It was business as usual, until the moment Lisa decided to escalate the situation. The elderly woman had barely taken a sip of her coffee before she calmly walked back to the counter. She wasn't demanding, nor was she aggressive. She simply placed her cup on the counter and spoke in a gentle but firm tone. "Excuse me, miss. Could I get a little more cream in this?" Lisa turned slowly, her annoyance evident. "Really? You're going to complain about a simple black coffee?" She scoffed. A few customers nearby glanced up from their phones and newspapers, sensing the edge in Lisa's voice. The elderly woman, however, remained composed. "I'm not complaining. I'm just asking for some cream." Lisa let out a dramatic sigh, grabbed a small container of cream, and slid it across the counter without a word. But she did it with force, causing the container to nearly tip over onto the floor. The elderly woman caught it just in time, her fingers steady despite her age. She nodded in thanks, but before she could turn away, Lisa muttered under her breath, "People like you always want something extra." That was the moment the cafe's atmosphere shifted. A few customers stopped their conversations entirely. A businessman near the window glanced up, his brow furrowed. A young couple exchanging smiles over their breakfast suddenly looked toward the counter, unsure of what they had just heard. The elderly woman's grip on the small container of cream tightened slightly. She turned back to Lisa, her gaze steady, unwavering. "People like me?" she repeated. Her voice wasn't raised, but there was an undeniable weight to her words. Lisa rolled her eyes and waved dismissively. "Forget it. Just enjoy your coffee." For a moment, silence stretched between them. The tension was thick enough to cut through. Then, with the same quiet dignity she had carried since walking in, the elderly woman picked up her coffee and returned to her seat. But Lisa wasn't finished humiliating her. As if wanting to prove a point, she leaned over the counter toward a nearby customer, a well-dressed man in his 40s. "Can you believe this? Some people just don't belong in places like this." The man's face stiffened, and he shifted uncomfortably. But Lisa barely noticed. She was too busy reveling in her small victory, until the elderly woman stood up again. This time, she walked past the counter and toward the restrooms. As she did, Lisa smirked. "Watch this," she whispered to a co-worker beside her. She grabbed the elderly woman's half-empty coffee cup from the table, walked over to the sink behind the counter, and, without hesitation, poured the rest of the coffee down the drain. Then, in one swift motion, she refilled the cup with steaming hot coffee and waited. A few minutes later, the elderly woman returned and reached for her cup. Just as she lifted it, Lisa suddenly bumped into the table, intentionally. The coffee sloshed over the cup's rim, spilling directly onto the woman's hands and coat. Gasps erupted across the cafe. Someone dropped a spoon. A woman at the next table instinctively covered her mouth. The elderly woman inhaled sharply, but didn't cry out in pain. Instead, she slowly placed the cup down, her fingers trembling slightly from the heat. Lisa, standing beside her, feigned innocence. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, but the smirk tugging at her lips told a different story. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the cafe doors swung open. A group of men and women in sharp business suits stepped inside, scanning the room. Within seconds, their eyes landed on the elderly woman, and they rushed toward her. Lisa watched in confusion as the group stood beside the elderly woman with a level of respect that sent a cold shiver down her spine. And then, the words that changed everything. "Madam Hughes, are you all right?" Silence fell over the cafe. Lisa's blood ran cold, because in that moment, she realized she had just humiliated the most powerful woman in the entire room. The cafe fell into an eerie silence. Every pair of eyes in the room shifted between the elderly woman, now drenched in hot coffee, and the sharply dressed professionals who had just entered. The group moved swiftly, their polished shoes clicking against the tile floor as they rushed to her side. Lisa's heart pounded. The way these people addressed the woman, Madam Hughes, made her stomach twist into knots. One of the men, a tall figure in a navy blue suit, immediately removed his coat and placed it over the elderly woman's shoulders. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" he asked, concern laced in his voice. The woman, despite everything, remained composed. She gently shook her hands to rid them of the remaining liquid before offering a soft but firm reply. "I'm fine." Lisa's throat went dry. Who the hell is this woman? She took a small step backward, gripping the counter as her mind raced. Her face, moments ago filled with arrogance, was now a mask of panic. She had just thrown coffee on someone important, someone powerful. The other customers, sensing the shift in power, sat in stunned silence. Even those who had earlier ignored the elderly woman now watched with wide eyes, realizing they had severely underestimated her. The businessman Lisa had prioritized over the elderly woman earlier cleared his throat awkwardly and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The young couple near the window exchanged guilty glances. They had all been complicit in her mistreatment, and now they feared they had just witnessed something much bigger than they had anticipated. One of the assistants, a woman in a sleek black dress, turned to Lisa with narrowed eyes. What happened here? Lisa swallowed hard. Think. She forced a nervous smile, trying to maintain some sense of control. It was an accident, she stammered. I didn't mean to spill. The elderly woman, still dabbing her coat dry, let out a quiet sigh before cutting Lisa off. Number it wasn't. Lisa froze. The café collectively held its breath. Madame Hughes finally lifted her gaze, meeting Lisa's eyes directly for the first time since stepping into the café. And in that moment, Lisa realized something chilling. The woman had known exactly what she was doing from the very beginning. She hadn't walked in aimlessly. She hadn't been some random customer. She had been observing, testing, watching, and Lisa had failed, miserably. A bead of sweat trickled down the back of Lisa's neck as Madame Hughes turned to one of the suited men. Did you get everything? Lisa blinked in confusion. What does she mean by that? The man nodded and pulled out his phone. Every word. Lisa's stomach dropped. Her mind replayed every cruel thing she had said, every dismissive glance, every sneer, every single damning moment that had unfolded in the last 20 minutes. And now, it was all recorded. Lisa's breath hitched. Wait, I didn't know who she was. I thought, Madame Hughes raised an eyebrow. You thought what? Lisa had no answer. Because what could she say? That if she had known Hughes was someone important, she wouldn't have treated her this way. That the only reason she had shown any kindness to others was because of their money and status. The weight of her own actions pressed down on her chest like a vice. The woman who had entered the café that morning as a seemingly insignificant figure had just flipped Lisa's entire world upside down. And the worst part? This was just the beginning. Lisa's mind spun wildly. This can't be happening. Just minutes ago, she was the one in control, belittling a woman she thought was beneath her. And now? Now, she was the one drowning under an unbearable weight of judgment. The man holding the phone tapped his screen, playing back a snippet of the recording. Lisa's own voice, sharp, condescending, unmistakable, rang through the café like a death sentence. People like you always want something extra. Some people just don't belong in places like this. Lisa's stomach twisted. Hearing the words aloud, words she had spat out so carelessly, felt like a slap in the face. She looked around desperately, searching for an escape. The café patrons, who had previously ignored the situation, were no longer pretending to be occupied with their meals. Now, they watched with a mixture of shock and unease. Even the businessman she had prioritized over Madame Hughes looked disgusted. No one was on her side. The weight of the silence was unbearable. Madame Hughes finally spoke. Tell me, Lisa, she said, her voice steady, calm, yet unyielding. What exactly gave you the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't? Lisa's lips parted, but no words came out. What could she say? That she didn't mean it? That she was just having a bad day? Nothing could erase what she had done. Madam Hughes stepped forward. The café seemed to shrink around Lisa as the woman continued. I've spent my life building something from nothing. I've worked harder than you can imagine, fought battles you'll never understand. And yet, the moment I walked in here, you reduced me to a stereotype. You assumed I was less. Lisa's face burned. And the worst part, Madam Hughes tilted her head slightly. You didn't even hesitate. Lisa's breath was shallow, heart hammering in her chest. She could feel it. The end of everything she had worked for. The man in the navy suit turned to Madam Hughes. What do you want us to do, ma'am? Lisa's pulse spiked. Please, she blurted out, voice cracking. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know who you were. Madam Hughes let out a soft, bitter laugh. That's the problem, isn't it? The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room. Lisa had nothing left to say. She had spent the entire morning believing she could judge people based on their appearance. And now, she was face to face with the consequences of that mindset. So tell me, Lisa. Madam Hughes took one final step closer. If I had been a nobody, if I really had been just a homeless woman, would that have made your actions acceptable? Lisa's body went rigid. She felt as if she had been punched in the gut, because the truth was painfully clear. She had only cared because Madam Hughes had power, and now that power was about to come crashing down on her. Madam Hughes exhaled slowly, turning to the suited man beside her. Make the call. Lisa's stomach dropped. What call? What is she talking about? And then, her manager walked in. His face twisted in confusion as he took in the sight before him. His boss. The founder of the very café he worked for, standing with a soaked coat, surrounded by a team of high-ranking executives and a pale, trembling Lisa. And that's when Lisa knew. She was done for. The café manager stepped forward, his brow furrowed as he took in the situation. His eyes darted between Lisa, who was now visibly shaking, and Madam Hughes, whose coat was still stained with coffee. The realization hit him like a freight train. Madam Hughes, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know you were coming today. Madam Hughes turned her gaze to him, calm but unwavering. I didn't announce it, she replied. I wanted to see how my employees treat customers when they think no one is watching. The weight of those words sent a cold chill down Lisa's spine. She hadn't just mistreated a random customer. She had failed a test she didn't even know she was taking. The manager turned sharply to Lisa, his expression darkening. What did you do? Lisa opened her mouth, scrambling for an excuse, but there was nothing she could say. Not after everything had been recorded. Not after an entire café full of witnesses had seen her humiliate Madam Hughes. She could see it happening, her future slipping through her fingers. I didn't mean to, she tried weakly. It was just a mistake. Madam Hughes lifted a hand, silencing her. Number it wasn't. Lisa flinched. The tension in the room was suffocating. Customers who had previously ignored the situation were now watching with wide eyes, fully understanding the gravity of what had just unfolded. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, guilt washing over them for having done nothing when they witnessed the mistreatment earlier. Lisa's breath came in short, panicked bursts. She had to fix this. She had to fix this now. Please, she begged, turning to Madam Hughes. I was having a bad day. I didn't know who you were. If I had known. If you had known, Madam Hughes repeated, her eyes narrowing. And if I had been just another poor old woman off the street? Would you have treated me any differently? Lisa's voice died in her throat, because the answer was painfully clear. She wouldn't have. The manager, realizing there was no salvaging this, exhaled sharply and ran a hand down his face. "Lisa," he said, his voice cold. "You're fired." Lisa's legs nearly gave out beneath her. "Wait, no. You can't do that," she cried, desperation creeping into her voice. "I need this job." Madam Hughes tilted her head slightly. "And did you think about that before you threw coffee on me?" Lisa had no response. The manager crossed his arms. "Get your things and leave." Tears welled in Lisa's eyes, but she could see it in his face. There was no room for negotiation. The cafe had an image to uphold, and firing her was the only option. She turned, glancing around the room, searching for sympathy. But all she found were blank, unforgiving stares. No one was going to help her. With trembling hands, Lisa untied her apron and set it on the counter. She cast one last glance at Madam Hughes, who simply watched her with quiet finality. And then, with her heart pounding and her future shattered, Lisa turned and walked out of the cafe, knowing she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The cafe remained eerily silent, even after Lisa had walked out the door. The tension that had gripped the air slowly began to fade, but the weight of what had just transpired still lingered heavily. Madam Hughes exhaled softly, brushing off the remaining coffee stains on her coat. One of her assistants immediately stepped forward. "Would you like us to file a formal complaint, ma'am?" She shook her head. "There's no need." The assistant hesitated. "But she's already facing the consequences of her own actions," Madam Hughes interjected, her voice calm, yet firm. "Losing this job isn't the worst thing that will happen to her. What she did today will follow her in ways she hasn't even realized yet." The assistant nodded, understanding. The cafe manager, still visibly shaken, approached hesitantly. "Madam Hughes, I can't tell you how sorry I am. If I had known you were coming." Madam Hughes turned to him, her eyes steady. "And that's exactly the problem." The manager stiffened. "If I had been just another old woman, just another customer off the street, this would have gone unnoticed. No one would have intervened. And that," she said, letting her gaze sweep across the cafe, "is why this moment matters." A murmur of understanding rippled through the room. Some customers lowered their eyes in shame, realizing how complacent they had been. A few nodded, acknowledging the harsh truth she had laid bare. Madam Hughes straightened her posture and reached into her purse, pulling out a crisp bill. She placed it on the counter and smiled at the barista behind the register. "For the coffee." The young barista hesitated. "Ma'am, please, you don't have to." "I know." She smiled knowingly. "But I choose to." With that, she turned and walked toward the door, her team following closely behind. But just as she reached the exit, she paused. The cafe was still filled with people, and they were still watching her. She glanced back over her shoulder and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "We don't get to decide another person's worth based on how they look, and we certainly don't get to treat people as if they're less than us, just because we think we can." A heavy silence fell over the cafe. Then, slowly, one person began to clap. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire cafe erupted into a round of quiet, yet powerful applause. It wasn't just for Madam Hughes, but for the truth she had spoken, for the lesson they had all learned today. She nodded once, then pushed the door open and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. As the door swung shut behind her, the cafe felt different, because after today, nothing would ever be the same. As the story fades, leaving behind a powerful lesson about respect, humility, and human dignity, let's take a moment to reflect. Have you ever judged someone too quickly? Have you ever witnessed injustice and stayed silent? Stories like this remind us that the way we treat others, especially when we think no one is watching, defines who we truly are. So tell me, what would you have done if you were in that cafe? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think twice about how we see and treat people, make sure to hit that like button. It might seem like a small action, but it helps spread this message to more people who need to hear it. And of course, if you want more eye-opening stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. We have plenty more coming your way. Stories that challenge perspectives, spark conversations, and remind us of the power of kindness. So go ahead, like, comment, and subscribe. Because the more we share stories like this, the more we remind the world of what truly matters. See you in the next one.